Darkness. It's a simple absence of light, or is it? For centuries, blackouts have served as the backdrop for some of the most terrifying human experiences. When the power cuts out and shadows consume the world, our minds begin to play tricks, or worse, reveal what's been hiding in plain sight. In this video, we'll share 4 bone-chilling blackout stories, tales of families, towns, and individuals who were plunged into darkness and forced to face the unthinkable. These aren't just stories of power outages. They're stories of fear, survival, and the strange things that emerge when the lights go out. So are you ready? Let's step into the shadows and uncover the truths that haunt the dark. The house that never recovered. It started like any other summer evening. The Smith family was gathered in their cozy suburban home, waiting out a sudden thunderstorm. The rain tapped relentlessly against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees. But inside, they felt safe, at least for a while. At 8:23 p.m., the lights flickered once, then twice, and finally, everything went dark. The house plunged into silence, save for the occasional rumble of thunder. Emily, the youngest of the Smith children, clutched her stuffed rabbit and asked, "When will the lights come back?" Her mother reassured her, though even she couldn't hide the growing unease. Outside, the storm seemed relentless. Lightning illuminated the yard for fleeting moments, casting eerie shadows across the lawn. Each flash made it harder to ignore what looked like movement, something shifting just beyond the tree line. "Probably just the wind," Mrs. Smith muttered to herself, though she avoided looking too long. Inside the house, things started to feel off. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The family's dog, Max, who usually curled up by the fireplace during storms, was nowhere to be found. When they finally located him, he was standing at the basement door, growling low and steady. His ears were pinned back, and no amount of coaxing would get him to move. "It's just the storm," Mr. Smith said, though his voice lacked conviction. But even as he spoke, a loud thud echoed from below. The sound was sharp and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "What was that?" Emily whispered, clutching her rabbit tighter. No one answered. By midnight, the atmosphere in the house had changed entirely. The once cozy home now felt like a trap. Shadows seemed to lengthen and shift in ways that defied logic. The faint sound of footsteps could be heard coming from the basement, slow and deliberate. At first, they dismissed it as the old house settling in the storm. But then the footsteps grew louder and closer. "Who's down there?" Mr. Smith called out, grabbing a flashlight. His voice echoed in the silence, but there was no reply. Gathering his courage, he opened the basement door and descended the creaky stairs alone. The others waited at the top, straining to hear anything. Over the pounding rain, then came the scream, short, sharp, and guttural. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam casting wild shadows on the basement walls. Mrs. Smith grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. "Stay together," she whispered to her children, trying to keep calm. Minutes felt like hours until Mr. Smith finally emerged from the basement. But something was different. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and he said only one thing: "We're not alone." From that moment on, the house seemed alive. The air grew colder with every passing minute, and the shadows on the walls seemed to crawl like living creatures. Emily clung to her mother, her wide eyes darting around the room as if she could see what no one else could. "We have to leave," Mrs. Smith whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced at the front door and then at the windows, but every attempt to open them failed. The doors were jammed, and even when Mr. Smith tried breaking a window with a chair, the glass didn't even crack. It was as if the house itself was holding them hostage. The whispers began shortly after. At first, it sounded like the faint rustle of wind through the walls, but soon it turned into distinct voices. They were low, guttural, and incoherent. "What are they saying?" Mrs. Smith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. None of them dared to respond. By 3 a.m., the house was in chaos. The lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. The walls groaned and creaked, as though the entire structure was breathing. Emily, sitting on the couch with her stuffed rabbit, suddenly tilted her head and smiled. "They're coming," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Who's coming, Emily?" Mrs. Smith asked, her heart pounding. But Emily didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the hallway, where the shadows seemed to grow darker, almost like a black fog consuming the light. Max, their dog, barked furiously, but then he yelped and retreated under the table, whimpering. "This isn't just a blackout," Mr. Smith muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. He grabbed a kitchen knife, though deep down, he knew it wouldn't help. The whispers turned into laughter, high-pitched, childlike giggles that echoed through the halls. Emily began laughing too, mimicking the eerie sound. "Emily, stop!" Mrs. Smith pleaded, shaking her daughter. But Emily's gaze remained fixed on the hallway, her laughter growing louder and louder. The radio crackled to life again, this time blasting static so loud it hurt their ears. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped, replaced by a single word spoken in a distorted, chilling voice. "Run!" Mrs. Smith grabbed her children, pulling them close. "We need to stay together," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Whatever happens, don't let go of me." But as she spoke, the temperature in the room dropped even further. Their breaths came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the windows. Suddenly, the basement doors slammed open with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the house, and a low, rumbling growl emerged from the darkness below. "It's in the basement," Mr. Smith said, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. The family huddled together as the growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something heavy dragging itself up the stairs. The floorboards creaked under its weight, and a sickly, rotten smell filled the air. "What is it?" Mrs. Smith cried, holding her children tightly. As the thing reached the top of the stairs, the lights flickered once more, and for a split second, they saw it, a shadowy, grotesque figure with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. It stood in the doorway, staring at them. Then, the lights went out completely. For what felt like an eternity, they sat in darkness, listening to the creature's labored breathing. And then it began to move. Slow, deliberate steps echoed through the room, circling them. The whispers started again, louder this time, almost chanting. "Leave, leave." Emily's voice broke through the chaos. "We can't leave," she said, her tone unnervingly matter-of-fact. "They won't let us." Mrs. Smith grabbed her husband's arm. "We need to do something. We can't just sit here." But before Mr. Smith could respond, the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek. The sound was so loud it felt like their heads would explode. And then, silence. When the lights flickered back on, the creature was gone. But the room was in shambles, furniture overturned, walls scratched with deep gouges, and the smell of decay lingering in the air. The family didn't wait to question it. As soon as the door unlatched, they ran, leaving everything behind. They never returned to the house. Years later, it remains abandoned, a crumbling shell of its former self. Locals say that on stormy nights, you can still hear the whispers, the laughter, and the sound of something heavy, dragging itself across the floor. And no one who enters ever stays for long. The forgotten storm, the summer of 1998, was remembered for its relentless heat and thunderstorms that seemed to roll in without warning. For the residents of Green Hollow, a small town nestled between mountains, it was just another humid evening until the storm arrived. It started with a strange stillness. The wind, which had been gusting all day, suddenly stopped, and the air grew so heavy it was hard to breathe. "Feels like the calm before the storm," an old farmer muttered as he locked his barn. But what came next was unlike any storm Green Hollow had ever seen. The power cut out at exactly 9:13 p.m., plunging the town into complete darkness. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the mountains in jagged flashes. The thunder was so loud it rattled windows, but it was the rain that caught everyone off guard. It didn't fall straight down. It moved in swirling patterns, as if being pulled by an unseen force. Sarah and her brother, Ethan, were home alone that night. Their parents had gone to a town meeting and promised to be back before the storm hit. "It's just rain," Ethan said, trying to reassure his younger sister as she peered nervously out the window. But Sarah wasn't convinced. "It's not just rain," she whispered. "It's different." The first sign that something was wrong came when their dog, Rosie, began barking uncontrollably at the back door. Her barking turned to whining, and then silence. Ethan opened the door to check, but Rosie was gone. "Maybe she ran into the shed," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Minutes turned into hours, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. The rain seemed to grow heavier, and with it came a low humming noise, almost like a chant carried by the wind. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, clutching Ethan's arm. He nodded, his face pale. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then the lights in the house began to flicker, even though the power was out. "How is that possible?" Ethan whispered, stepping back. The flickering grew brighter, almost blinding, and then stopped completely. The house was once again plunged into darkness, but the humming continued, louder now, almost deafening. Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. Not a polite knock, but a heavy, insistent pounding. "Mom and Dad?" Sarah called out, running toward the door, but Ethan grabbed her arm. "Wait," he said, his voice low. "They have a key. They wouldn't knock." The knocking grew more frantic, shaking the door on its hinges. "Who's there?" Ethan shouted, but no answer came. Then, as quickly as it started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the rain and the distant humming. The siblings decided to stay in the living room, too afraid to split up. They lit a few candles and tried to keep their minds occupied, but every so often, they'd hear strange noises, a shuffle of footsteps upstairs, a faint tapping on the windows, and once, what sounded like a faint whisper calling Sarah's name. "Why is this happening?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ethan tried to reassure her, but his own hands were shaking. "It's just a storm," he lied, though even he didn't believe it anymore. At exactly midnight, the storm seemed to reach its peak. The rain was so loud it drowned out everything else, and the lightning was almost constant, casting eerie shadows across the room. Then came the voice, "Let us in." It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew louder with each repetition. "Let us in, let us in." Sarah covered her ears, crying, as Ethan stood frozen, staring at the front door, where the voice seemed to be coming from. "Who are you? What do you want?" Ethan shouted. The voice stopped, replaced by laughter cold, cruel, and echoing as if it came from inside the house. The siblings backed away, clutching each other as the laughter turned into a growl. The growling grew louder, shaking the very walls of the house. The candles blew out, plunging them into darkness once again. And then they saw it, two glowing eyes staring at them from the hallway. The creature stepped into the dim light of the lightning flashes, revealing a twisted, shadowy form with long claws and an unnaturally wide grin. "Run!" Ethan screamed, pulling Sarah toward the back door. But when they reached it, the door wouldn't budge. "It's locked," Sarah cried, though she hadn't locked it. The creature moved closer, its growl turning into a distorted screech that made their ears ring. Desperate, Ethan grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the window. This time, the glass shattered and the siblings climbed through, cutting themselves on the shards. They ran into the storm, the rain and wind whipping against their faces. When they looked back, the creature was standing in the broken window, watching them. Its grin widened as it raised one clawed hand and pointed toward them. "We'll see you soon," it hissed, its voice carrying over the storm. The siblings ran until they reached the town square, where they found their parents and several other residents huddled together. Everyone had a story: strange noises, shadowy figures, and an overwhelming sense of dread. But when the storm ended as abruptly as it began, all traces of the supernatural vanished. To this day, Green Hollow's residents refuse to talk about that night, but those who lived through it will never forget the storm or the eyes watching them from the dark. A powerless town's grim secret. The town of Black Hollow was known for its remote location and eerie quiet. Tucked away in a dense forest, It was the kind of place people passed through, not stayed. But one summer evening, a power outage left the town in complete darkness and uncovered a secret no one was prepared to face. It began just before sunset. The lights flickered once, then twice, before going out completely. At first, the townsfolk assumed it was just a temporary outage. The old power grid wasn't reliable, and storms often knocked it out. But the skies were clear, and there was no sign of weather to blame. In the darkness, the town's true silence became oppressive. No hum of refrigerators, no buzz of streetlights, just the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. "This feels different," muttered Harold, the town's electrician, as he fumbled with his flashlight. But no amount of tools or wires would bring the lights back on. As the hours passed, people gathered in the town square, their flashlights flickering against the shadows of the surrounding forest. Parents held their children close, and whispers filled the air. Whispers about the legend of the Black Hollow mines. The mines were long abandoned, sealed decades ago after a series of mysterious disappearances. Officially, the town said the mines were unstable, but locals whispered about the voices heard in the tunnels and the shadows that seemed to follow anyone who dared venture too deep. Most dismissed it as folklore until that night. By 10 p.m., Harold, the electrician, decided to investigate the substation on the edge of town. "It's probably just a blown transformer," he told the crowd, though his unease was clear. Armed with only a flashlight and his toolbox, he headed into the trees. An hour passed, then two. Harold didn't return. "He probably got stuck," said Mayor Gibbons, trying to calm the growing panic. "I'll go check on him." The mayor and two volunteers set off into the woods, their flashlights bobbing in the distance. But by midnight, they too were missing. The town square, once filled with uneasy murmurs, fell into complete silence. Then came the sound. It started as a low hum, almost like a chant carried on the wind. The townsfolk froze, their flashlights flickering. "Did you hear that?" Someone whispered, but before anyone could respond, the hum turned into a guttural growl, echoing from the direction of the mines. "It's just the wind," an older man muttered, though his voice trembled, but no one believed him. The sound was unnatural deep, resonant, and filled with something that felt alive. Suddenly, the growling stopped, replaced by footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, they echoed from the forest edge. "Who's there?" Someone called, their voice breaking. No answer came, but the footsteps grew louder, closer. The townsfolk backed away, huddling together, their flashlights aimed at the darkness. Then they saw it. Emerging from the forest was a figure tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long to be human. Its face was featureless, save for two glowing white eyes that seemed to pierce through the dark. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The sheer presence of the thing sent a wave of terror through the crowd. "Run!" someone screamed, breaking the spell. Chaos erupted as people fled in all directions. Flashlights tumbled to the ground, beams of light scattering wildly. Sarah, a teenage girl, tripped and fell, her flashlight rolling away. When she looked up, the creature was standing over her, its head tilting unnaturally as it reached out. Before it could touch her, another sound shattered the night, a loud, ear-piercing shriek from deep within the mines. The creature froze, its glowing eyes flickering. Then, without warning, it turned and sprinted back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The townsfolk regrouped, shaken but alive. "What was that?" Sarah's mother asked, clutching her daughter tightly. No one answered. The sound from the mines, whatever it was, had saved them. But the question remained, was it a warning or something worse? By morning, the power had inexplicably returned. Radios buzzed back to life, and the town tried to move on. But something had changed. The mines, once a forgotten relic, now loomed large in everyone's mind. Some said the creature was still out, there, waiting. Others believed the mines held an even darker secret. To this day, no one in Black Hollow dares to go near the mines. And when the lights flicker, as they often do, the townsfolk hold their breath, listening for the sound of footsteps in the dark. The endless shadow had started with a rumor. "Have you heard about the shadow?" People in town would whisper, their voices low, their eyes scanning the room as if the thing they feared could hear them. It wasn't a shadow in the traditional sense, not one cast by the sun or a lamp. This shadow seemed alive, stretching across walls and floors, moving in ways that defied logic. At first, the stories were dismissed as local gossip, probably just kids playing tricks, the older residents would say. But those who saw it described the same thing, a dark amorphous mass that moved with purpose. It always appeared during blackouts when the power was out and the darkness was at its most complete. For years, the shadow was just a tale to scare children until the blackout of 2015. The blackout started on a cold winter night. The storm had rolled in fast, knocking out power across the small town of Cedar Pines. Residents lit candles, bundled up in blankets, and waited for the lights to come back on. But as the hours dragged on, something about this blackout felt different. It began with a knock on the Garcia family's door. Elena Garcia, a single mother of two, opened it hesitantly, only to find no one there. "Probably the wind," she murmured, shutting the door firmly. But when she turned around, her daughter Mia was staring at the far wall. "Mom," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow moved. Elena frowned. "Shadows don't move on their own, sweetheart." But when she looked closer, the dark blotch on the wall seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. She shook her head, chalking it up to fatigue. "It's just your imagination," she said, though she couldn't quite convince herself. But the shadow didn't stay on the wall. Over the next hour, it crept across the ceiling, sliding from corner to corner. Elena lit every candle she could find, hoping the light would dispel it, but the shadow seemed unaffected. By midnight, it had grown larger, its edges flickering like smoke. Across town, similar incidents were unfolding. In the Johnsons' home, their dog, Max, barked furiously at a patch of darkness in the kitchen. When they tried to lead him away, he refused to move, growling until the shadow suddenly darted toward the ceiling and vanished. What the hell was that? Mr. Johnson muttered, his hands trembling. At the town's small hospital, the generator kept flickering, casting the halls in intermittent light and shadow. A nurse on duty swore she saw something slithering along the floor, but when she turned to look, it was gone. Patients began murmuring about something in the dark. By 3 a.m, the shadow had consumed nearly the entire Garcia living room. Elena kept her children close, her heart pounding as she watched the black mass pulse and shift. "Stay here," she whispered, grabbing her phone to call for help. But her phone screen wouldn't turn on. The battery, fully charged an hour ago, was dead. Then came the sound. A faint, low whisper, like wind slipping through a crack in the window. Except there was no wind, and the sound was coming from the shadow itself. "Mom, it's talking," Mia said, clutching her brother's arm. Elena stepped closer, her pulse racing. The whisper grew louder, forming words she couldn't quite understand. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. The shadow stopped moving. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, it answered, "You." Elena stumbled backward, grabbing her children. "We're leaving," she said, pulling them toward the front door. But the shadow moved faster, stretching across the floor to block their path. The lights from the candles flickered and died, plunging the room into complete darkness. The whispering returned, louder this time, overlapping voices that seemed to close in around them. Across town, other families were experiencing the same terror. The shadows moved with purpose, cornering people in their own homes. A few brave souls tried to leave, running into the storm, but they swore the shadows followed them, stretching across the snow like an inky tide. Back at the Garcia home, Elena's son, Luis, grabbed a flashlight and shone it directly at the shadow. For a brief moment, it recoiled, shrinking back to the corners of the room. "It's scared of the light," he yelled. Elena scrambled to find more flashlights, lighting up every corner of the room. But the shadow wasn't gone. It hovered at the edges of the light, growing denser, darker. "We can't keep it away forever," Elena said, her voice breaking. "We have to find another way." That's when the storm suddenly stopped. The wind, the snow, even the faint howling sound in the distance, all of it ceased. The silence was deafening. Then slowly, the power returned. The lights flickered back on, and the shadow vanished instantly, leaving no trace. The Garcia family stayed awake until dawn, afraid to close their eyes. When they ventured outside, the streets were empty, eerily quiet. Neighbors emerged from their homes, sharing similar stories. Shadows that moved, whispered, and cornered them in the dark. The blackout of 2015 was never explained. Officials blamed a freak storm, but those who lived through it knew better. The shadow wasn't gone. It was waiting, biding its time until the next blackout. And when the lights flickered, as they always did in Cedar Pines, people would hold their breath, wondering if the endless shadow had returned. Darkness is a force that strips away the distractions of the modern world, leaving us alone with the unknown. For those who have lived through terrifying blackouts, the silence and shadows become more than a lack of light. They transform into something alive, something watching. From the haunted Smith House to the chilling Black Hollow mines, and the shadow that moves with purpose, these stories remind us of how vulnerable we are when the lights go out. Were these encounters the product of fear-fueled imaginations? Or are there things in the dark we were never meant to see? One thing is certain: the next time the power cuts out and you're left in silence, take a moment to listen closely. You might hear the faint whisper of a shadow, the hum of something lurking nearby, or worse, you might see it staring back at you. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more chilling tales. And remember, the dark may be empty, or it may be full of things waiting to be discovered.